apologize for that. Lesson 111 is where we're on, what we're on today, and the title of it is Reforming Fundamentalism. An introduction. In the previous lesson, we learned about the founding and history of Grace Bible College, originally Milwaukee Bible Institute. We suspended our study of the school's history in the year 1968. As we will see in future studies in this project, 1968 would prove to be a fateful year in the history of the Grace Movement. This was the year that Pastor Stam broke away from the GGF over disputes with the faculty and administration of Grace Bible College. In order to properly understand the Stam, GBC, GGF controversy, we need to understand something about the theological mood of the nation after World War II. In other words, Stam's dispute with GBC/GGF was part of a larger cultural and theological trends affecting the American church. I alluded to this last week, okay? What ends up happening with Stam, GBC, and the GGF, there's more to it than just what's going on between those individuals that were part of those events. There's a bigger trend within American Christendom at that time, of which that dispute ends up to be a part of. In the years following World War II, after the national crisis was over, some fundamentalists thought it was time to reform fundamentalism and purge it of old ideas and unwanted leaven. At the forefront of this reevaluation of fundamentalism was Carl F. Henry's 1947 book, The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism. In the preface, Henry called for a rebirth of fundamentalism, predicting that the movement would, predicting that the movement would be dead within 2 generations if it was not reformed. Quote, "Unless we experience a rebirth of apostolic passion, fundamentalism in 2 generations will be reduced either to a tolerated cult status or in the advent of Roman Catholic domination in the United States, become once again a despised and opposed sect. The only live alternative, it appears to me, is a rediscovery." Yeah. And I see why you underline that question mark there, Sylvia. Rediscovery, I think, this means of the Reformation's classics, I'm going to have to check this, and redemptive power of God, I apologize for the typo, which shall lift our jaded culture to a level that gives significance again to human life. It was the rediscovery of classic ancient philosophy that gave incentive to the Renaissance humanists with its disastrous implication for Western culture. The hour is now ripe, if we seize it rightly, for a rediscovery of the Scriptures and of the means of the incarnation for the human race. Now look, you need to understand what's going on here. Okay, World War II is in the recent past. As the West becomes more and more aware of the horrors of the Holocaust and other things that were taking place, within Nazi Germany and so on, as well as the emergence of the Iron Curtain and the whole standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union with the Cold War. All these things are going on. What Henry is calling for here is a sort of a rebirth of the social conscience of Christianity, as you'll see, I think, as we go through this a little bit more. But these guys are saying that fundamentalism has to reform itself or it's going to be dead within 2 generations. That's the basic claim here. These are all from the preface of his book. Henry goes on to express his deep concerns as follows. "It is not this doctrinal assault on the central affirmations of our faith that here distresses me. What concerns me more is that we have needlessly invited criticism and even ridicule by our tendency in some quarters to parade secondary and sometimes even obscure aspects of our position as necessary frontal phases of our view. With the collapse of Renaissance ideals, it is needful that we come to clear distinction as evangelicals between those basic doctrines on which we unite in a supernaturalistic world and life view and the areas of difference on which we are not in agreement, while yet standing true to the essence of biblical Christianity. It is an appreciation of, not a revolt against the fundamentals of the faith for which I plead." Now look at it. This is sort of the first of a commonly repeated mantra in our day of let's not major on the minors and let's just all rally around the things that we agree on, but the things that we agree about, and sort of, all hold hands and sit around the campfire and sing Kumbaya, and that sort of thing, okay? So Henry is saying, notice what he says. He says, by a tendency in some quarters to parade secondary and sometimes even obscure aspects of our position as necessary frontal phases of our view. What this is going to come out to is next week when we go actually look at Henry's book is he is an anti-dispensationalist, okay? And he is going to end up saying that arguments over the timing of the millennium, the timing of the rapture, any of these issues, these are secondary issues and should not be issues over which people divide and separate, and we should, be rallying around those ideas that we have in common for the good of the order, as it were. If you go to page 2, and I'm going to need help on exact pronunciation of this guy's last name, Dr. Harold John, how do you say this?
Okenga.
Okenga?
I think.
It's Akinga.
Akinga? Gives the following endorsement of Henry's work in the book's introduction. Quote, if the Bible-believing Christian is on the wrong side, now watch, of social problems, such as war, class, labor, liquor, imperialism, etc., it is time to get over the fence to the right side. The church needs a progressive fundamentalism with a social message. If Acts 15, 13 through 18 outlines God's program of pre-millenarianism is correct, the church will not preach on Paris conferences or liquor. Yet it will be indifferent to these pulse beats of the world's life. If we vacillate between fundamentalist isolationism and cooperation with the Worldwide Council of Churches, it is because we cannot be fatalistic on ethical problems. Yet fundamentalism is precisely that. It is impossible to shut the Jesus of piety, healing, service, and human interest from a biblical theology. The higher morality of redemption does not invalidate more consistency. A Christian world and life view, embracing world questions, societal needs, personal education, ought to arise out of Matthew 28, 18 through 21 as much as evangelism does. Culture depends on such a view, and fundamentalism is prodigally dissipating the Christian culture accretion for centuries and a serious sin. A sorry answer lies in the abandonment of social fields to the secularist. Here then is a healthy antidote to fundamentalist aloofness in a distraught world. Dr. Henry may well call for an evangelical fundamentalist ecumenicalism and for unity to face social needs. Now, I don't think I need to explain what exactly he's saying here. Okay? He's saying that fundamentalism has abandoned, let's just use his words, he's calling for a progressive fundamentalism with a social message. He says that he accuses fundamentalism of fatalism, of not being willing to speak out against social evils, and says that if they don't, he says it's a serious sin, and that they've abandoned social fields to the secularist, and is saying that fundamentalism or evangelicalism needs to adopt a message with a social component to it. Now, I don't know, when I read this reminds me a lot of the emergent movement of within the last 10 to 15 years. Seems to be sort of recycling some of this thinking that Henry is calling for here at the end after World War II. But you got to understand, this book by Carl F. Henry, the modern, I always get the title confused, The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism, is sort of a opening statement of a group of intellectuals within fundamentalism that are going to try to reform it from within. And they're going to do it by advocating for exactly what Akinga, or whatever, is calling for here when he talks about a progressive fundamentalism with a social message. Thus was, last point in the introduction, thus was the alarm sounded to reform fundamentalism after World War II. A new generation of evangelical intellectuals, such as Henry and Okenga, sought to chart a new course for fundamentalism moving forward. Eventually, the ripples caused by this tidal wave of change would impact the grace movement. Any questions or comments about the introduction? When I was reading this, Craig, I'm glad you're here. I was thinking about some of the discussions we've had in the past about the emergent church. And when I read particularly the piece here from the introduction by Okenga, it sounds to me to be very similar to some of the things that the modern emergent guys are saying. Do you see it that way?
I see it as that's what we're supposed to be doing to usher in the kingdom, basically bringing the kingdom to earth.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if these guys are really seeing it like that, are they? Is that
Well,
what they're doing too?
I'm not gonna. I'll leave that up to you.
The emergent church is much more mystical and
Yeah, it is.
and ecclesiastical than these guys were more practical type of thing. And as with most of this stuff, there is a truth in their argument. Fundamentalism had become so sophisticated in their isolationism. You know, you had first, second, and third degree separation taught in. I've been exposed to that type of thing.
Yeah.
That's how sophisticated they had become with their isolation.
And that is a fair point to acknowledge. They had become highly legalistic and highly exclusive. And these guys are coming along and saying, well, you know, this isn't good, and if we don't change this, it's gonna, fundamentalism is going to be dead within, 20 years or so. So Mike is right. There is an aspect here that these guys are identifying certain aspects of fundamentalism that certainly were, not good. But let's back up just for a minute. We've been studying in great detail O'Hare sounding the alarm against fundamentalism and saying to these guys, look, if you don't adopt and understand a proper dispensational understanding of the Scripture and understand the grace of God and how this is supposed to work and motivate and so forth, this is exactly what you end up with. And in my opinion, these guys, instead of going with O'Hare's solution, they come up with their own solution that's going to eventually swing the pendulum in a completely different direction. That's just my assessment. You're certainly free to disagree with that if you want. So from evangelicals to fundamentalists to neo-evangelicals. The term evangelical dates from the 16th century and was then used to refer to Catholic writers wishing to revert to more biblical beliefs and practices than those associated with the late medieval church. It was used especially in the 1520s when the term évangélique, French, and evangelists, I guess I'd say it, in German, came to feature predominantly in the polemical writings of the early Reformation. So, the early Reformation shows a use of this word, what becomes in English, the English equivalent of the word evangelical. Evangelical, from the Greek for gospel, eventually became the common British and American name for the revival movements that swept back and forth across the English-speaking world and elsewhere during the 18th and 19th century. Central to the evangelical gospel was the proclamation of Christ's saving work through His death on the cross and the necessity of personally trusting Him for eternal salvation. Since Protestantism was by far the dominant religion in the United States until the mid-19th century, evangelicalism shaped the most characteristic style of American religion. Being a style as well as a set of Protestant beliefs about the Bible and Christ's saving work, evangelicalism touched virtually all American denominations. These denominations, such as Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Disciples of Christ, and others, had much to do with shaping American culture in the 19th century. Most major reform movements, such as anti-slavery or temperance, had strong evangelical component. Evangelicals had a major voice in American schools and colleges, public as well as private, and much to do with setting dominant American moral standards. So, in the United States, the early conceptualization or usage of the term evangelical referred to basically a cross-denominational group of believers that were believing very similar things about the Bible and about the necessity of personal faith in the work of Christ for salvation. And there were evangelicals that were in every denomination and so forth in the 1800s, is basically what Marsden is saying. Now, by the way, just a quick comment. George Marsden, whose books I'm using for this, is, I would argue, the preeminent historian of the last 35 years about this subject. He's written at least 4 to 5 books just on the history of fundamentalism alone in the United States. Fundamentalism in American Culture, Reforming Fundamentalism and the Establishment of Fuller Theological Seminary, Evangelicalism and Fundamentalism, and at least 1 or 2 more that he's written. Cultural changes during the time period from the 1870s to the 1920s created a major crisis within the evangelical coalition. Essentially, it's split in 2. On the one hand were theological liberals who, in order to maintain better credibility in the modern age, were willing to modify some central evangelical doctrines, such as the reliability of the Bible or the necessity of salvation only through the sacrifice of Christ. So if we think about this term, initially in the 1800s, this term is used to describe a broad group of people, of Christian believers within the United States from across denominations that believe basically in the reliability of the Bible. You could even say inerrancy. They also believe in the reality of salvation, that you have to trust in the work of Christ individually for your salvation. And then what starts to happen between 1870 and 1920 is a division. And that division, one of those groups is going to become known as the modernists. Okay, now the modernists, and then the other group is going to become known as what? The fundamentalists. Okay, now this is a bit of an oversimplification, but I'm trying to get you to understand just the general flow of what was going on. Okay, so between these years here, there's a crisis within evangelicalism. That crisis is caused by a few things. Number 1, Darwinian evolution. Okay. Number 2 would be the German higher critics in Germany disputing the reliability and the inerrancy of the Bible. Science and so forth is causing some evangelicals to begin to question things after the Civil War here. Okay. One group, the modernists, they are going to stress the Bible's human origin. And begin to say things like the Bible is not what? It's not inerrant. It's not. You can't necessarily trust it. Stuff like that. Okay. Look at the next point, halfway down page 3. On the other hand, were conservatives who continued to believe the traditionally evangelical doctrines and took the name fundamentalists. Fundamentalists were ready to fight liberal theology in the churches and changes in the dominant values and beliefs in the culture. Since fundamentalism was originally just the name for the militantly conservative wing of the evangelical coalition, fundamentalism was at first as broad and complicated a coalition as evangelicalism itself. It included militant conservatives among Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, disciples, Episcopalians, holiness groups, Pentecostals, and many other denominations. So I want you to understand, in the 19th century, before the 1870s, and this period of time that I have outlined here between 1870 and 1920, evangelical was a sort of a catch-all phrase, and it was used to describe people in any denomination across the spectrum within the American church that believed certain basic things. Okay, the crisis time period here between 1870 and 1920 caused a split there, and the modernists break off. And the fundamentalists. Originally, the term fundamentalist referred to anybody that was against the modernists that would have been in any denomination. Same as these guys up here. Okay? Everybody understanding that? Any questions about that? Fundamentalism was the response of traditionalist evangelicals who declared war on these modernizing trends. On one front, the fundamentalists emphasized the fundamental doctrines of the faith, dogmas that liberal Protestants or modernists typically denied. Modernists, influenced by higher criticism, emphasized the Bible's human origins. Fundamentalists countered by affirming its inerrancy in history and science, as well as in faith and doctrine. So there's a controversy here. We've talked about this a little bit already, but we're sort of setting some background up here. So this rift occurs. Originally, a fundamentalist is described as anybody within the Protestant church that would have believed in inerrancy of the Bible, that the Bible was of divine origin, and the other, I'm just going to summarize them, fundamentals of the faith. The death, the burial, resurrection of Christ, the virgin birth, all those things. And in the teens, so I'll say I think it's between 1913 and roughly 1919, those years might not be exactly correct, there's a magazine published titled The Fundamentals. So the group basically gets their name, fundamentalists, from subscribing to the basic beliefs that are being outlined and described in that magazine called The Fundamentals. Okay? And they're outlining those things. So the original use of the term fundamentalism is describing a broad range of American Protestants across the denominational spectrum that are believing in these fundamental things, as opposed to or standing against the modernists, the liberal faction within the Protestant church across that same denominational spectrum that is citing the Bible's human origin, some of which are embracing evolution and other aspects of the modern worldview, thus the term what? Modernist. Any questions about that? Bottom of page 3. The most influential anti-modernist doctrine, eventually spreading through most of interdenominational fundamentalism, was dispensationalism. Part and parcel, what becomes also associated with fundamentalism is dispensationalism, which helps explain why O'Hare is screaming loudly at the fundamentalists for not having what he perceives to be a consistent what? Dispensationalism. Okay? But anyway, let me finish reading this. The most influential anti-modernist doctrine, eventually spreading through most of the interdenominational fundamentalism, was dispensationalism. This doctrine also provided a general theory of history, proclaims that the present church age, the sixth dispensation in the world's history, was marked by apostasy in the church, and the moral collapse, it should say moral collapse, I believe, of so-called Christian civilization. Thus, dispensationalism predicted the rise of modernism and emphasized the necessity of fighting to preserve the true faith and personal purity. These emphases also led dispensationalists to an anti-modernist view of interpreting the Bible. They insisted on the inerrancy of Scripture and argued that each word was the perfect Word of God. So understand what's going on here, okay? Dispensationalism says, especially classic dispensationalism, says that every dispensation ends in what? Failure. Okay? Judgment. So they're saying then, so the dispensationalists are saying, listen, the church age is no different, and so to some degree, they are predicting what? That. So the emergence of modernism fits the dispensational narrative of the church age is going to end in what? In failure and apostasy. And so this dispensationalism then eventually is going to become, to some degree, embedded within fundamentalism, and that's the point that Marsden is trying to bring out there. Okay? Now, certainly it's not accepted necessarily in all quarters across the board, but you need to think back. Remember what we studied about the Schofield Reference Bible. The Schofield Reference Bible that came out in 1909 spread dispensationalism far and wide across, as a principle of Bible study across a wide spectrum of American denominations. Okay? And when this controversy continues to erupt, specifically in the 1920s, this dispensationalism is definitely a part of what was going on. Any questions or comments there? Point number 3. Yet another front in fundamentalism's campaign was the battle for America, the battle to save the nation as an evangelical civilization. While in theory this agenda conflicted with dispensationalism's pessimism about Christian civilization, in practice the two managed to coexist. Fundamentalism was thus a coalition, fighting against their common enemies, modernism and secularism. Now, I've said a lot there, trying to summarize a lot of history in about 15 minutes. Does anybody have any questions about that? Marsden is right. There's a slight tension here between dispensationalism's idea that everything is going to end in failure anyway, and the fundamentalist desire to save American culture. There's two ideas there that don't seem to necessarily fit nicely together, but that didn't seem to bother them. Yeah.
Was the NIV the first alternative translation that was added during this time,
No.
or when did that come out?
The NIV didn't come out until the 1970s. But so you have versions of the turn of the century era, like the Revised Standard,
Okay.
the Revised Standard, the
American.
American Standard, and a couple other ones that predate the NIV quite significantly.
So do you think those help the modernists with their viewpoints?
I don't know. Anything I would say about that would be complete speculation. But I do know that fundamentalists held to the King James Bible for not maybe for the same reasons that some people today might, but that was the standardized, accepted, version of the Bible to use, and was so for quite a long time, even though there are some of these newer versions that were out there. And frankly, that's got something to do with the Schofield Reference Bible. The popularity of the Schofield Reference Bible being, the text of it being the King James text. And obviously the study notes being Schofield's compilation. Yeah.
The full version of the RSV was published in, I'm thinking, around 1946. I have one at home that I got as a child. And I believe that it was put together under the auspices of the World Council of Churches. So the modernism thing came before the new translations, I believe.
Yeah, I certainly would say there was one in Britain even before that, even before the turn of the century, and I can't remember the name of it.
That was the Revised Standard.
Revised-
And then it became the American.
Then the Americans
Standard.
did their own version.
Yeah, right, it's just
Yeah.
an Americanized version, but she's talking about the Revised.
The RSV.
The RSV became the standard Pew Bible in denominationalism in the 50s.
Yeah, in the
Right about the
50s
time
it
he's
was.
talking about right now.
Yeah.
Fred?
Yeah, I grew up in this area, lived here all my life. This area is heavily embedded with covenant theologians as far as Reform, First Reform, stuff like that. They're not dispensationalists, yet I think they would consider themselves fundamentalists, I'm not sure.
Yeah, they're
I would say
anti-modernist.
I would say they're anti-modernist, yeah. And that's going to bring up some stuff that we're going to talk about in a future lesson about the dispensational covenantal rift. The Presbyterian Church eventually, in a synodical action, comes out and officially denounces dispensational theology in the 1940s. Okay, and I've got charts, fascinating charts about Dallas Theological Seminary In the 1930s, the highest student population in Dallas Theological Seminary were Presbyterians.
In the 70s?
In the 1930s.
Or the 30s?
After the synodical action on the part of the Presbyterian Church in the 1940s, the number of Presbyterians going to Dallas Theological Seminary, boom, falls off that fast. They just stop going. And what's real fascinating is that the original generation of professors at Dallas Theological Seminary were all Presbyterians. John Walvoord, Dwight Pentecost, Chafer, Schofield, all these guys were Presbyterians. Okay? So you're right though, Fred, not all of the fundamentalists adopt, and that's why we're talking here in big coalitional type terms. Not all of them adopted dispensationalism. But even if they didn't adopt dispensationalism, if they were in any of these other categories, they would have still considered themselves to be a fundamentalist. But it is also true that a great number of those who would have identified themselves as fundamentalists were embracing teachings that were dispensational. And when I say that, I'm obviously referring to what I'm going to call standard traditional Acts 2 Schofieldian dispensationalism. And that's where O'Hare comes in and says, if we're going to be able to answer the modernists and if we're going to be able to answer the Pentecostals, we need to have a consistent dispensationalism. And he viewed this, the standard Acts 2 Schofieldian view, as having fundamental inconsistencies within it that were not able to adequately answer certain aspects, particularly of Pentecostalism. So eventually, even within fundamentalism, the Pentecostals, as time goes on, what starts as sort of a unified coalition against the modernists is going to start to have infighting and factioning within it, and that's what Mike's talking about when he's talking about third, fourth, fifth degree separation and all that sort of stuff. So eventually, you're going to end up with fundamentalist groups that are so isolated, and so we're not going to have fellowship or talk to anybody, that they're basically, they've so isolated themselves that they're not going to really have fellowship with anyone. Yeah.
The Protestant Reformed Church in this town and the Puritan Reformed churches would be considered the fundamentalists in the covenant areas today. So they're still around.
Mm-hmm. Where are we at? Top of page 4, right?
Yeah.
During the early decades of the 20th century, denominational colleges and seminaries cut themselves loose from their evangelical moorings. Bible institutes sprang up as alternatives, usually emphasizing evangelism, missions, and dispensationalist Bible study. In the 1930s, evangelicalism was not, this is important, was not a term much used in American religious life. The white Protestant world was still dominated by the mainline denominations, and these were divided by wars between fundamentalists and their sympathizers, and modernists and their sympathizers. Both sides had either claimed the appellation evangelical, so it was no longer as much use to either. Strictly speaking, most American Protestants were neither fundamentalists nor modernists, but were located somewhere in between. And that's Marsden's assessment. By the early 1940s, Charles E. Fuller of the did I miss one? I'm sorry. By the 1930s, northern white churches were undergoing realignment. The fundamentalists relocated and built their own networks of separate institutions. Uncounted numbers of fundamentalists left the major denominations to join or to found independent local Bible churches, or they forsook a more liberal denomination for a smaller, more conservative one. Most fundamentalists, nonetheless, remained quietly within the major denominations, hoping to work within existing structures, especially through conservative local churches. At the same time, they increasingly gave their support to a growing network of trans-denominational fundamentalist evangelical agencies. Look, the 1930s, this is exactly the time where not only have we seen the baptism arguments, but this is where you have the formation of the IFCA. You have all of these groups of people that are moving away from the mainline denominations to establish local fundamental independent Bible churches. And that's happening in the 1930s, all right? And it's in that context, again, that O'Hare is saying, hey, we need a more consistent dispensationalism. So by the early 40s, Charles E. Fuller of the Old-Fashioned Revival Hour had gained the largest radio audience in the country. In the 1920s, Fuller had been a typical fundamentalist militant and had split a local Presbyterian congregation to form his own group. By the time he became a national figure, he adopted a positive fundamentalist stand of refusing to engage in controversy or make separatism a test of orthodoxy. So Fuller has gained a national audience. He's backed off some of his former positions on things, and now he's advocating for what he calls positive fundamentalism that's going to downplay the differences between the different groups. Also, next point, in 1942, the National Association of Evangelicals, NAE, was formed as a positive fundamentalist coalition. As part of an effort for an American and world revival after World War II, a group of positive fundamentalist intellectuals began organizing a move away from dispensationalist emphasis. With America's emergence into world leadership after the war, they saw a unique opportunity for reconstructing Christian civilization. If America's evangelical tradition could be revived, to attain this ambitious goal, they recognized that it would be necessary to build on fundamentalist claim to stand in a broad tradition of Augustinian orthodoxy. There's again your fundamental Calvinistic views, rather than to promote the more narrow dispensationalist teaching of recent invention. They also deplored fundamentalism's emphasis on personal ethical prohibitions at the expense of a positive social program, a theme enunciated in Carl Henry's Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism in 1947. They were embarrassed, furthermore, by the anti-intellectualism they had come to associate with dispensational fundamentalism, which had been promoted primarily through Bible institutes and pragmatic popularizers.
Well put.
So, understand what's going on. As America comes out of World War II, there's a group of young evangelicals within fundamentalism that are looking out and saying, we don't like what we see. We don't like the emphasis on dispensational Bible study, and we don't like the prohibition against personal behavior. So this would be your can't play cards, can't go to movies, can't dance, can't all these rules and regulations that many of the fundamentalists had stiffly enacted upon their congregations and upon their constituency. And so what they're saying is, you guys are all worried about this. Meanwhile, meanwhile you have the Holocaust, and you have racial unrest, and you have labor unrest, and you have all these things going on, and you guys are all worried about whether or not somebody's wearing a woman's wearing a skirt or jeans or playing cards or mowing the lawn on Sunday. Okay, so they're sort of going to start bringing forth a cry here to change the situation. So, any questions on page 4? Yeah.
That statement at the bottom there, they were embarrassed furthermore by the anti-intellectualism and so forth. It kind of, if you think back through the whole history of Christianity, going way back to that was the complaint that the Pharisees had against the disciples and Christ and his disciples, that they were unlearned and ignorant men and so forth, and that they had no business being about doing their work when they were learned Pharisees. They were, and that's something, intellectualism made me think of your message on casting down, imagination and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, you know.
Fred, you're right, and what's going to be this neo-evangelical emphasis on intellectualism is going to be one of the major beefs that STAM ends up having with GBC. That's why we did this. You have to see this from a bigger picture before you can understand what happened within the grace movement. Okay? Because what happened within the grace movement is a microcosm of what was going on a bigger scale throughout the American church after World War II. Okay? And I agree with you, Fred, there's a very fine line here on this anti-intellectualism. Because on the one hand, I see it, but on the other hand, dispensational theology was based very heavily on a Scottish common sense philosophy that said that things that are different can't be the same. So there is, even within that, an underlying intellectualism, whether they wanted to recognize it or not. So this is a real slippery slope. But you are right in at least elaborating on that point. Yeah.
Another thing that I'm noticing is what shook up traditional Christianity at the time of the Reformation was the printing press. And what shook up traditional Christianity at this point in time was the radio.
You can make that argument, certainly. People got, even O'Hare, by the 40s, Fuller has the largest radio audience, but by the time O'Hare dies, O'Hare is the second longest running radio program in the history of radio, second only to Amos and Andy. So, these guys took advantage of the media that they had available to them to try to reach as many people as they could with, what they thought was right. Yeah.
I'm remembering an anecdote, or it was a political cartoon when Ronald Reagan was president, and he used to go on TV and talk to all of us, and there was this cartoon where congressmen were saying, he's going over our head and going straight to the people. And that's kind of the thing that happened with the radio, and earlier with the printing press.
And I think that even happened, you could make the argument that was part of the appeal of the Schofield Reference Bible. Mm-hmm. That somebody could buy it and have a wealth of study tools right at their fingertips without having to rely on anybody else. Obviously they're relying on Schofield, but that was part of the appeal of what he put together.
Yeah, and the average family could afford to have one.
Yeah, you could afford to buy one copy of a Schofield Reference Bible, even if you couldn't afford to buy a whole shelf full of study books.
Yeah.
So, top of page 5, the neo-evangelical reformers of fundamentalism were among the first to anticipate the possibility of an evangelical resurgence. Already in the 1940s, they were talking grandiloquently, that's his word, not mine, not only about such a comeback, but even about the restating of the fundamental thesis and principles of Western culture, as Carl Henry put it, remaking the modern mind. They were convinced that if the voice of fundamentalists could be tempered slightly, evangelical Christianity could win America. I'm just going to read through this because we're running short on time, okay? And then we'll take questions at the end. Most simply understood, the new evangelical reformers reputed both the doctrinal and cultural implications of a repudiated the doctrinal and cultural implications of a thoroughgoing dispensationalism while they remain loyal to the fundamentals of fundamentalism. Theologically, they stood for a moderate form of classic Calvinist Protestantism, as opposed to some of the inventions of dispensationalist Bible teachers. They were much more likely to be broadly Calvinistic, interdenominational evangelicalism that had widely influenced 19th century America. So off of this, we have, I'm just going to abbreviate and say new evangelicals. Okay? The new evangelicals do not like dispensational theology. It's a no-no. And what they're trying to do is go back to the way it was here. before the break between the modernists and the fundamentalists. So they are going to grab the term evangelical and they are going to try to reinstitute that term, and eventually they become known as neo or new evangelicals. They do not like dispensational theology, and they're interested in sort of reaffirming this inter-trans-denominational Christianity that was the norm within American life before the fundamentalist modernist controversy. Okay, so in the history of Fuller Theological Seminary, founded in 1947 by such new evangelical reformers, we can trace the renewal of America's 19th century evangelical heritage as it developed from a reform within fundamentalism into a separate movement. So here's the point. The guys that eventually are going to be in this movement here used to be where? They would have been considered fundamentalists at that time. They are breaking from the fundamentalists to try to recapture, if you will, American life and theology before the modernist fundamentalist controversy. All right? The most notable effort to counter such trends was the founding of Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California in 1947. Charles E. Fuller provided the early funding, but left most of the management of the institution to the intellectuals, headed by Harold Okenga, which is the same guy that wrote in the introduction in Henry's book, as president, and including among its early faculty an impressive lineup: Carl Henry, Edward Carnell, Wilbur M. Smith, Everett Harrison, Gleason Archer, Harold Linsell, George E. Ladd, Daniel Fuller, and Paul Jewett. Through the Fuller faculty, though the Fuller faculty de-emphasized dispensationalism, they did not immediately repudiate their fundamentalist heritage. They were sincerely dedicated to Charles Fuller's idea of positive evangelicalism and were close associates of Billy Graham. The school paid in sincere respects to the fundamentalist doctrinal militancy, as well as by requiring creedal assent to the inerrancy of Scripture. So Fuller Theological Seminary is established, as it were, to be the anti-Dallas, in a sense. Okay? They are going to downplay and not talk and not discuss dispensational theology as a rule, while they are going to reaffirm inerrancy, the fundamentals of the faith, and the divine origin of the Bible. They don't want to have anything to do with dispensational theology. So that's Fuller Theological Seminary, established in 1947. During the 1950s, Billy Graham's success was rapidly changing the status of this predominantly positive evangelicalism that had been growing out of fundamentalism. Graham's vast popular appeal gave him virtual independence. The election of Eisenhower and Nixon in 1952 gave him entry into the White House. Most importantly, Graham's move toward the respectable center of American life precipitated a definitive split within the hardline fundamentalists in 1957. For his New York City crusade, Graham accepted the sponsorship of the local Protestant Council of Churches. Strict fundamentalists were deeply offended by this cooperation with liberals, and they anathematized Graham. In the aftermath of the resulting schism with the coalition, fundamentalism came to be a term used almost solely by those who demanded ecclesiastical separatism. They called their former allies neo-evangelicals, picking up on the term new evangelicalism coined earlier by Okenga. Some of you probably were alive and remember some of that stuff.
So is the basic difference, at least in the beginning, between these guys and the fundamentalists, is dispensationalism?
That is one of the main differences.
And they believe in inerrancy, salvation by faith alone in Christ?
So I would say that they are anti-dispensational, They are anti-separatists. They don't like this schismatic divisions within fundamentalism. They are for, I'll say, social reform, and that the church should actively be involved in societal social reform. But they do bring over these elements with them here: the divine origin of the Bible and the so-called fundamentals of the faith, inerrancy, divine origin of the Bible, and the so-called fundamentals of the faith would basically be the platform in summary of this group. Billy Graham becomes sort of the national spokesman for what they're doing. And in 1957, when he accepts this support from this liberal group, the hardline fundamentalists anathematize Billy Graham. And then from then on, you now have fundamentalism and neo-evangelicalism, starting as two sort of now distinct groups. At first, this group was just sort of trying to grow out of fundamentalism. Well, eventually it came to a point where they really could no longer, for lack of a better term, coexist with each other. Fred?
As a sub-point to the anti-separatist, you could have pro-ecumenicalism.
Yeah.
Because
How do you
basically they would say, you know, they would include any church that wanted to be involved in, you know, no matter what they taught.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yep. It's sort of the opposite of the anti-separatist portion of that. To answer your question? So, top of page 6, and we only have 5 minutes left. I included this brief history of terminology from Marsden's book, Fundamentalism in American Culture. I think if you go through the 4 indented points, you'll see that they basically just summarize what we've been doing this entire hour in a sort of nice, neat package. So for the sake of time, I'm going to commend you to read those 4 points on your own, and I want to go to the bottom of page 6. So, some summary things to end this lesson. Fundamentalism was originally a broad coalition of anti-modernists. From the 1920s to the 1940s, to be fundamentalist meant only to be theologically traditional, a believer in the fundamentals of evangelical Christianity, and willing to take a militant stand against modernism. Conservative was sometimes a synonym. So to call oneself a fundamentalist did not necessarily imply that one was either a dispensationalist or a separatist. Neither did it necessarily imply, despite efforts to the contrary by its detractors, that one was anti-intellectual or a political extremist. On the other hand, original fundamentalism did include certain elements, including tendencies toward all the traits mentioned above, that separated it from the mainstream of traditional evangelical Protestantism. As we have seen, much of the plot that shaped the Fuller heritage centered around efforts to get rid of those more recent aspects of fundamentalism, and yet retain its essential commitment to evangelical orthodoxy and anti-modernism. The term evangelical became a significant option when the NEA was organized in 1942. In the context of the debate with modernism, fundamentalist was an appropriate alternative. In other contexts of the debate within the fundamentalist movement, the term evangelical was preferable. So what Marsden is doing a very good job here of doing is explaining to you the subtleties of the usage of the words, and how the meaning of the words have changed throughout history, and specifically the history of these controversies. Once the debates within fundamentalism led to a split, the new evangelicals, or evangelicals, came together as part... Let me start over. Once the debates within fundamentalism led to a split, The new evangelicals came together as part of formed fundamentalists. Although they successfully reappropriated evangelical as their primary designation for biblicist American Protestantism, by no means all evangelicals had shared their struggles with fundamentalism. Now, I hope this lesson is critical in leading to something very important within the history of the grace movement, okay? Because again, what ends up causing a split in the GGF and Stam to leave the GGF and to basically have disagreements with the faculty of GBC is totally related to this controversy between the fundamentalists and the neo-evangelicals. Okay? All right, so we got a few minutes left. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Just as it is, as a side note, this is sort of important American history for you to know anyway, in my opinion. Okay, especially if you're just thinking about general church history in the United States. This is important stuff to kind of try to wrap your mind around. Yeah.
And I know how people stick with their denominations and they're very faithful to their denominations, but is there any record of the struggle that congregations themselves of people that weren't involved in these decision-making of who did what, is there any record of how they struggled through this process? Or was there a lot of going back and forth of they're not being happy with this idea their church decided on, so they're switching? So I imagine that would be too much information to really keep track of. But
No, I think you can make some general observations about that. If you take Fuller as an example, Fuller was a Presbyterian in his early career, okay? But he was not a modernist. And he was in a local congregation where there was a controversy between the conservatives and the modernists within that congregation over who was going to, run, what kind of church is this going to be?
yeah.
And so the end result of that was Fuller left that church and started a new one. And so within that local congregation, all the people that were against modernism, no doubt followed Fuller in going and establishing a new church. And that's just one example of what was happening across the denominational spectrum as a result of this modernist fundamentalist controversy. That's how the IFCA and these independent fundamental Bible churches were established. Groups of people within denominational structures that did not like the inroads that modernist liberalism was making into those denominations, so they left and started their own churches. That's how the Bible church movement started. And then then you have all the other things that went along with that. Fred?
Yeah, you're within your mainline denominations, like in Presbyterianism, for instance, you developed a liberal group and a conservative group.
Yep.
And same with Baptists, liberal groups and conservative groups. And
Same with the Reformed churches, Mike's pointed out already.
So you've had all these, within each group, you had a division of this thing right here.
Yeah, and all that stuff was going on during the same decades.
Yeah, all this stuff is happening within a concentrated period of time. And so, yeah. And then, so now think just for a minute. So now you have this whole thing going on. And then here comes O'Hare and says to these guys, wait a minute, your dispensationalism's faulty. If you think about it in that context, that might have just been too much. That might have just been too much for them to what? To swallow. Okay? Now I'm not excusing it. I'm just trying to get you to think about it through the prism of history. That along comes O'Hare and says, your dispensationalism is faulty and you need to rethink your dispensationalism, and that might have just been too much change for some of these guys. Particularly when he says, oh, and by the way, you shouldn't or don't need to water baptize. And then they're like, whoa, wait a minute. Okay? Now, again, I'm not trying to excuse it or anything else. I'm just trying to get you to think about what the bigger trends were and how they might have received some of that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, the attitude that you can make a really good argument for is we have a big enough of an enemy with Darwinian evolution, people claiming the Bible isn't even the Word of God, not to mention the fact that man is fallen and needs a Savior, and here the church, Christianity, is fighting with itself about stuff, and that's what we're all preoccupied with and not dealing with this other stuff so effectively.
And that's where these guys come in. You guys are just doing what? Fighting. We are intellectual. We are more refined. We're not going to what? We're not going to do this stuff. And so you have a distinct break. Okay? So what I want, and look, I'm not saying that those guys were right. Okay? If that's what you're thinking I'm saying, you should know by now that that's not what I'm saying. I just want you to think about, you add that piece into this whole pot that's already bubbling and boiling, and for some of them it might have just been too much. Or too much change too fast. Or it could have just been plain and simple a host of other things. They didn't want to give up their constituencies. They didn't want to give up their position. There's a lot of other factors that play in. But what I'm trying to get you to see is that this is a multifaceted issue that is occurring over a period of time. But we are already 5 minutes past. We need to go. So thanks for your attention. Next week we are going to look at Henry's book.
Page 6 is the GHP.